Thank you, Aaron. With the furloughs now set to take effect, many people are wondering how New York got to this point to begin with, and also what impact these cuts will have on day-to-day life. So joining me to add some perspective on this is E.J. McMahon. He's the director of the Empire Center for New York State Policy. E.J., thanks for coming in.
You're welcome.
So actually there was some debate here about whether or not these furloughs are legal, with a number of state lawmakers saying these are totally illegal and yet we're going to pass them. So where do you come in on that?
Well, I don't think it's clear. I think it raises what lawyers call novel issues, to be sure. It hasn't been tested. There's a number of aspects of this that haven't been tested. The irony is, I think that the one path they had, that the governor had, that is clearly legal, would have been trying to freeze the employees' pay, to impose a freeze that is statutorily because of the state's financial situation.
Now, you actually had a trio of labor attorneys come in and advise you guys on this, right? And they indicated that they thought, from their perspective, it was legal.
We had some of the state's leading labor lawyers, led by a guy who's negotiated countless deals over 40 years. And his opinion was that, in fact, there's precedent to do that. Now, the governor has kind of rejected that idea so far. Ironically, if the governor, I think, had acted more consistently much earlier, starting in late 2008, I think we wouldn't be having this particular problem right now. We might have a late budget, but I think that when the governor complains about state employees and the unions not having come to him with any sacrifices or his inability to get any savings out of them, I think that is in part due to the way that he's handled the situation.
So that's interesting, because actually the governor will tell you sort of ad nauseum that he's the guy who first sounded the alarm, and he's the guy who told everybody that the state was headed for fiscal, insolvency, et cetera. And then he subsequently negotiated this fifth tier, and that's part of the problem, right? Because he promised everyone in exchange for no fifth tier, there will be no layoffs.
Well, it goes back before that. He is right. He is the guy who sounded the alarm. He was making a very compelling argument right from almost the moment he took office that we were headed to big trouble, even before the really big financial crisis hit in the fall of 2008. The problem is he kind of blinked at the whole issue in his very first budget. You recall he had a big hunk of money in there that was supposed to be savings from the workforce.
I remember that, yeah.
And reporters, you and other reporters said, well, Governor, if they don't make you an offer, if they're unwilling to agree to the things you put in the budget, will you do layoffs? And he said, oh, no, I don't want to talk about that. In fact, he was reluctant to and even unwilling to use any leverage against the unions right up until a year ago at this time, right before the budget was agreed to last year. He suddenly came out of the blue and said, I'm laying off 9,000 workers because they haven't. So the problem is, and this has kind of antagonized the union, it's ironic. These state workers, these state unions have done better comparably than other state workers in other states with severe budget problems who've already been furloughed or laid off in large numbers or both. Because this governor has, in a way, in effect, treated them with kid gloves.
But you heard when
they're angry at him. They hate him. They have no respect for him.
I mean, you've seen the rhetoric all day long.
Yes.
They're furious. They feel like he's not talking to them. In fact, some of them would say he's not talking to us at all. The rhetoric between him and Danny Donahue is just through the roof at this point.
But they don't. And I think what you're seeing there is because he hasn't been consistent. I think the problem is that he hasn't been consistent. I think he happens to be right now in saying the right things. The problem is he's been so inconsistent on this issue. I think he's antagonized them.
But what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Inconsistent?
Well, he's run hot and cold. For instance, as you said, at first he doesn't. He carefully avoids threatening anything. Then he comes out of the blue, kind of surprises them a year ago and says, I'm going to lay off 9,000 people. And they said, what? And you remember then, at that point, one of the union leaders suggested he was on drugs or something.
Oh,
remember that?
That's right.
I mean, it was pretty insulting.
That's right.
Then, a few weeks later, he announces the pension reform deal and the buyout program, which turned out to be a flop, and said, I won't lay anybody off, which was unprecedented.
Okay, but some of this is just a little bit of the, budget dance. I mean, you're seeing Mayor Bloomberg in the city do much the same thing to the state, right?
Yes.
If you guys don't end your stalemate, I'm going to lay off 6,000 and change teachers, which scares everybody to death because that's where the rubber hits the road in so many districts.
Yes.
And then, you scare me, I scare you, then we come together, we make a deal, and that's how the budget
there is no
dance
deal
works.
that can avoid dire consequences. I mean, they can't make a deal that's going to avoid some layoffs and some significant cuts. So now it's like a game of musical chairs. Everybody's looking what chair to fling themselves into when the music stops, because there's going to be fewer chairs.
Okay, but do you think that we're going to end up in the end with pay lags, which is actually something that had happened during the Cuomo administration? I mean, there is a precedent for the state employee unions to do that.
Right. We might. It's a lousy policy. Furloughs are a bad policy. Pay lags are a bad policy.
Well, but you're saying layoffs are the best policy.
Well, no, I'm not actually saying layoffs are the best policy. I think a freeze is the best policy. Here's the absurd part. We've gone through the last 2 years since the recession officially began. Personal income in New York has dropped sharply. Tax receipts have dropped. The economy is flat. A lot of people in the private sector, those who've kept their jobs, have had very flat wages. The cost of living has not increased at all. And state workers, just since the recession started, have had a more than 6% increase in their base pay, with 4% due to follow. The same is true on the local level. Teachers last year across the state had pay increases of 5.5%.
Okay, but there are state workers, I'm sure, who are watching this right now and throwing things at the television and saying, well, there were years that we got zero, or there are years and we're trying to do more with less, and you keep cutting back, and at this point it's dangerous, and at this point...
I think also, and those of us who live in this area all know state workers, there are also state workers who are saying that they think a lot of this is nonsense, and they'd be happy to take a pay freeze to save jobs and to skip this nonsense with lags and furloughs.
Okay, I hope these state workers are going to write into me right now.
Call in right now.
State workers to tell me.
Honestly, I mean, I think one of the other TV stations in this area back in January, when we floated the idea of the freeze, the guy went out to the corner of Washington Avenue and Swan and interviewed the first 4 state workers he came across. Not scientific, mind you, okay? But
no,
all 4 of them said,
highly unscientific,
right,
actually.
but the thing is, all 4 of them said, sure, I take a freeze to avoid layoffs. There's more than a few people. So then
why, if that is true, let's assume that's true,
yeah.
What's the disconnect between the leadership and the membership?
Well, there is no disconnect. The thing that people often overlook here is the fact that the unions themselves are political organizations and highly politicized organizations.
Right.
There's a strong element of theater in all this. The union leaders themselves are politicians who run for office, and in some cases are seeking higher office in national union bodies.
Right.
So, as I said, a lot of this is for effect. It's for theater. Nobody ever got elected union president by being willing to make concessions. That's not what the unions exist to do.
So what happens then? I mean, what are we going to see, in your best prediction, what comes next?
Well, I mean, I think that, as you suggested, some sort of muddle through that culminates perhaps in some sort of lag pay deal.
Mm-hmm.
I hope the governor sticks to his guns. He's declared that he won't make any kind of agreement to extend contracts, because I think the union's real fallback position is, we'll make an agreement with you on a number of things if you will extend our contracts, which expire a year from now.
But they want to extend into the next governor.
And let him get stuck with it. So if he doesn't do that, I think the best he can hope for now probably is a lag, or there's a chance he may realize his goal, which is simply to realize the savings that he's got in the budget, if it's upheld by simply doing a one-day furlough for 5 weeks.
Well, it's about $250 million, I think, that he has assumed. So we're going to have to see. And just today, we've heard that the lieutenant governor says he hasn't seen any progress in the budget talks. So I'm sure we'll be having you back, EJ, and I want to thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thanks very much.